name is Sloane D Biomed, and I'm going to be looking into hairspray toxicity. My research investigative question is, what are the effects of aerosol hairspray on tetrahymena? Why I chose to use hairspray. As a dancer, a lot of teammates and I frequently unintentionally inhale hairspray. Many of these individuals have complained of persistent coughing and wheezing when exercising throughout the season, including myself. Although a conclusion cannot be made as to if hairspray was the cause of this, I wanted to research to see if it was a potential factor. According to U.S. Cosmetic Care, 98.54 million Americans used hairspray in 2020, and this figure was projected to increase to 100.22 million in 2025. This shows how commonly used hairspray is in the U.S. Through research, I've decided to do my experimental testing on tetrahymena. Tetrahymena are unicellular eukaryotes, and their cells are extremely similar to human cells. This means that the test results can translate well to humans, and that's why they are better to use than other organisms. The gap that I'm researching is how is aerosol hairspray affecting tetrahymena. Now moving into past research. Poison control highlights that although hairspray is typically harmless as a cosmetic when used properly, when using it incorrectly, breathing in its fumes may be extremely dangerous to one's health. A study done by University of York showed that the chemicals that are seen mostly in aerosols that contribute to photochemical smog, damaging human health and vegetation. The report wants policymakers to promote less harmful propellants or non-aerosol alternatives, emphasizing the potential for significant air quality improvements by these small changes. This shows that aerosols not only can have negative effects on the environment, but also on human health. Hairspray effects have been tested in the past on other animals. A study done on male Winster rats, they were exposed to aerosol hairspray for up to 12 weeks to study lung toxicity. The study found that the chronic inhalation led to increased neutrophils in the lungs. This essentially just demonstrates that breathing in the hairspray caused inflammation in the lungs within the rats. There have also been human cases involving hairspray, one being a 60-year-old woman who developed fever and shortness of breath after using hairspray, and another being a 28-year-old female who had asthma, who presented with shortness of breath and chest pain after using a variety of different hairsprays. The human cases are pretty inconclusive though, since their symptoms could have been caused by multiple different things, so it's impossible to conclude that hairspray could have caused all these symptoms. Now moving into my methodology. This study explores the toxicology of hairspray and its effects on tetrahymena. The goal is to properly expose the tetrahymena to conclude a result as to how it affects its movement, liveliness, and the size of the culture. There are two main types of hairspray, aerosol and non-aerosol. From my experience as a dancer, I've known that aerosol is used most commonly. There are some non-aerosol options, but I decided to use aerosol in my experiment because that's what I had seen the most. The two brands that I decided to use were Bedhead and Tresemme because I found that these were a lot of the ones used by my fellow teammates. To properly expose the tetrahymena, I knew that just spraying an amount of hairspray on top of the neff, which is the liquid that the tetrahymena live in, would not be very effective. Instead, I chose to bubble in the hairspray into the neff. I did this by taking the nozzle off of the hairspray, then attaching securely with tape a straw to the edge of it so that I could insert the straw into the test tube and bubble in the hairspray. In the beginning of my experiment, I went in with a preliminary test trial, but I did not record any results. I wasn't sure how much hairspray to put in, and I didn't know what kind of effects were going to come from the hairspray. I did this test trial to prepare myself and determine what amount of hairspray will properly affect the tetrahymena without killing them all off. After this test run, I felt ready to begin my real experiment. I started with the control, and then I went into 3 different test trials, and I used Bedhead, Tresemme, and then I did a combination of the two to see if there was a different effect from combining the 2 brands. I cultured my tetrahymena and labeled the test tubes 1 through 10 in order to keep track of which was which. I kept track of how much hairspray I sprayed in by weighing the test tubes before and after spraying in the hairspray. I did my best to do an around 1 second spray, but the weight did vary a little bit. For the individual ones, it varied from 0.03 grams to 0.06 grams, and for the combination, it varied from 0.09 to 0.12 grams. Throughout the experiment, I took 3 sets of observations. First being the initial observations of the tetrahymena before I added in any hairspray, Then I observed them exactly 3 days later, and then 2 days after that, which was 5 days post-hairspray. Now, moving into my discoveries. This study's findings were fairly conclusive. I'm going to begin by comparing the pre-hairspray observations to the post-hairspray observations. Since my observations after 3 days and after 5 days were almost identical, I will just be comparing the initial versus the 3 days. In each of these observations, I took 30-second videos under the microscope, and I did this so I was able to look back at the tetrahymena's movement, and I will be showing screenshots from these to further explain the discoveries that I found. Starting with my control, you can see an initial and a post-hairspray. These were obviously very similar, which makes sense because I didn't add anything, and in both before and after, there was lots of movement within the tetrahymena, and they were very lively. For my initial observations for test tube number 2, which was the bedhead brand, I found that they were very lively and moving around quite a lot. But when I checked back in 3 days later after the hairspray, the movement was little to none. The culture of tetrahymena did not change much in size, but the movement went from a lot to a very slim amount. For my initial observations for test tube number 3, which was the Tresemme brand, I noticed that the size is pretty small and they had a moderate amount of movement. Then for my post-hairspray observations, I noticed a massive increase in size. The culture just about tripled in size, and I noticed that they were moving extremely slow. Although there was still movement, there was definitely a big decrease in the speed. For my initial observations for test tube number 4, which was the combination of the 2 brands, I noticed that the size was once again a little bit smaller, but the tetrahymena still had a lot of movement. The post-hairspray observation were pretty clear for this trial. There were big clumps, as you can see towards the side, and then for the non-moving, and those were all non-moving tetrahymena, which I assumed were most likely dead, and for the ones that were still moving, it was not very much. For my initial observations for test tube number 5, which was back to the bedhead brand, it was fairly small, but there was still a lot of movement. Then checking back in 3 days later, there was little to no movement, and there was no increase or decrease in the size of the culture. It stayed fairly constant. For my initial observations for test tube number 6, which was the Tresemme brand, I noticed that it was a pretty big culture and there was once again a lot of movement. This culture increased in size after the hairspray. I would say it about doubled, and there was big sections of either dead or non-moving tetrahymena. And for the ones that weren't in these bigger clumps, they didn't have very much movement, and if they were moving, it was very slow. For my initial observations for test tube number 7, which was the combination of bedhead and Tresemme, the movement was moderate and the size was a medium size. When I checked back in 3 days later, I noticed very big chunks, as you can see towards the bottom of the image. As for the other tetrahymena not in these clumps, they were not really moving except for about 10 to 15 of them. For my initial observations for test tube number 8, which was the bedhead brand, I noticed that it was a much smaller culture, but there still had a lot of liveliness within the tetrahymena. After checking back in post-hairspray, I noticed a slight increase in size within this culture, but a decrease in the liveliness that was there before. For my initial observations for test tube number 9, which was Tresemme, it was a moderate size and the tetrahymena had a lot of movement. After 3 days, I noticed a massive increase in size. I also noticed that most of the tetrahymena were not moving at all, and there was a little bit of movement towards the top, but not much. For my initial observations for test tube number 10, which was the combination of bedhead and Tresemme, it was a moderate size and the tetrahymena had a lot of movement. After checking back in after hairspray, I found the biggest clumps that I had seen yet. The tetrahymena were barely moving at all, and what I found interesting with this one was that if they were moving, it was like around themselves in a circular motion. To show the results in a clearer way, I've compared the different trials side by side to show the similarities and differences. So here we can see the bedhead results, and these all ended up being like fairly the same size, and post hairspray, all of the bedhead ones decreased in all motion. Here is the Tresemme results, and as we can see here that they all got a lot bigger in culture size, which is different from the bedhead results. And these ones you can see also a few clumps here and there, but not too many. And then lastly, here's the combination, and this one also had a major increase in size from the beginning, and there was also a ton of chunks of like dead tetrahymena on this one. My final conclusion for my experiment is that the bedhead hairspray resulted in no change in size and a decrease in movement. Tresemme resulted in an increase in size, decrease in movement, and a few clumps of tetrahymena, and the combination of the two brands resulted in an increase in size, a loss of movement, and where I also noticed the circular movements, and many clumps of tetrahymena. Through my experiment, it is shown that depending on the brand and whether they are combined, hairspray can have a negative effect on tetrahymena. This can translate in a way to human cells, as tetrahymenas are very similar. I think that attention should be brought to the harms that hairspray can have and how it could affect our bodies.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. How did your review of the methods used by scholars in the field inform your selection of a research method or process that aligned with your question?
Research used by scholars that I found have never tested tetrahymena or anything really similar, except I saw that study on rats. So their experiment kind of inspired mine because they did this by exposing a little bit at a time and then checking back in after a certain amount of time, which I kind of like followed that methodology.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. How do your findings provide direction for further research in the field?
I think that my findings could serve as a starting point for other researchers in the field because I showed clear results of the effects. And since I was unable to test on larger animals or humans, I think that a more developed researcher would be able to carry on this experiment and also be able to figure out like what exact ingredient in the hairspray was causing this.
Okay, thank you. The last question, what's the most important research skill you have developed as a result of this process, and how might you apply it to your future endeavors?
I think that the most important research skill that I developed was how to dive deeper into the articles that I was reading, because this is by exploring the article's content and evaluating like the credibility and bias within an article. And I think I can use this skill in the future because you can often be misled by websites, so like being able to identify unreliable information.
Okay, thank you.